Hello, it's just David here with my weekly message. Now, you know that we're doing our sort of 10 questions series. It's going well. Do still come along, particularly if any of the questions rather interest you. There's a sort of drink and a pud as well, and a sort of bit of discussion and thinking about the question. And I'm using these videos loosely to kind of give my answer, if you like, to the question, because I think in the sessions themselves, I'm just going to kind of open up discussion and sort of give us a variety of opinions. And I thought it might just be helpful in these videos to say, well, what do you think? And tomorrow we're going to be talking about what does science have to say about God. And I've got to keep this sort of brief because it's sort of my subject. Yeah, I mean, we've all got our kind of thing, and I suppose this is mine. And so, what does science say about God? Now, I should say, I mean, by science is shorthand, and again, one doesn't want to go into too much detail, but there's, science has sort of had various meanings over the years. But I'm talking about sort of biology, physics, chemistry, by which I mean an exploration of the physical world. And therefore, in one sense, doesn't have anything to say about God because God is beyond that. Can't be experimented upon. He can't be reproduced in equations. So, in one sense, it's a bit odd that sort of sometimes science and religion are seen in conflict. There's two very important things I think that actually have enabled, because actually historically they haven't been in conflict. I mean, see, it's quite a recent phenomenon. There's two things which have enabled them to flourish together in the West, particularly in sort of Western Europe, and that is that the Christian faith and other faiths, but particularly Christian faith, doesn't believe that they're part of the God is part of the physical world. So, and can't be found in the physical world. So, for instance, if you think God is a sort of mountain god of a special mountain that you can't put your foot on, then you can't kind of experiment and find out about that mountain. So that sort of religion actually stopped science happening in some senses. You couldn't do geology on that mountain because that mountain is sort of God. On the other hand, there are other sorts of religions that say actually the physical world isn't worth bothering about. It's not worth knowing about. Actually, what you want to know about is the eternal, or the state of my soul, or how to meditate and find God in meditation. So, well, you can do it if you like, but it's useless. It's rubbish. It's not worth finding out about. The Christian faith says, look, the physical world isn't God, but it's interesting. It's His creation. So, and it's wonderful. So go and explore it. So in a sense, that's why science and particularly Christian faith have flourished generally, actually together. You might think, well, do they today? And people like sort of Richard Dawkins, you probably sort of hear about, do they today? And you might think, well, why is this kind of idea of conflict? And there's two things really, and I want to talk about the first one, which is you might think there are scientific discoveries that tell us that there isn't a God. Now, when people say that, I say, well, what are they? Now, I fully agree, you can't be an absolute Christian fundamentalism. And interestingly, by the way, Christian fundamentalism doesn't exist in a very strict form until the 19th century. But yeah, you can't believe that God created the world in 7 days and the species are exactly as they are and always have been. And, fossils were put in the rocks to fall. You can't be a biblical fundamentalist. But you don't actually have to have a terribly sophisticated view of the Bible to say, really, there's no particular scientific discoveries that say that God doesn't exist. Miracles, well, the whole point of miracles is that they go beyond the natural law. They're an exception, they're the singularity. So, science tells us that dead people don't rise. Well, that's absolutely true. Of course, it's a general scientific law. I know that, you know that, everybody knows that. The point of Jesus is that he's the exception. He's the first fruits. He's the singular case, and that's the point of the miracle. So actually, miracles are okay. Galileo, you'll have to come along to session to hear about Galileo. Probably the most striking one was evolution. because that, that really did sort of hit at some core belief of Christians. I mean, both the world was much older than we thought, but also that human beings weren't terribly special. That actually we had evolved out of the higher primates, and that process of evolution might be continuing. And also, it meant that the species had died out, such as dinosaurs. And also, I think crucially, more modernly with genetics, that actually there's no sense of design behind it. There isn't a designer. That these things just happen randomly, and that's how evolution happens. So that's probably the most difficult one, but even that, I think, is not insurmountable. There are plenty of Christian people who are either evolutionists. I mean, I believe in evolution, and there are plenty of people who are sort of, professors of evolution or whatever. So I think, they are problematic, and of course, you think about these things forever. I think probably what has been the sort of focus of my research, and is probably more problematic to Christians, is something about the method of science, something called the scientific method. And I think what happens is, and interesting, it starts, one people it starts with is a local guy, the Earl of Verulam, Francis Bacon, in the 16th century, who says, really, the only way to find the truth of the matter is to experiment things. It's not to read learned books, but it's to go out there and kind of do your experiments. Now, this, of course, is tremendously fruitful. It starts the scientific revolution. But hold in your thoughts, you can't experiment on God. I mean, he won't sit still like that, and he's not there to be experimented upon. So that's kind of how it starts, and it's phenomenally successful. Now, I say this, what I say to people is, okay, I didn't hit the highest levels, but I was trained as a scientist. That's my first degree, Bachelor of Science, and before switched. So I'm impressed by science. It's done amazing things. Your mobile phone, men on the moon, satellites, etc., etc. They're amazing. Brilliant, fantastic. And that accelerated development over the last 300 years, which continues today, the innovation that's going on. The COP summit will be looking at a lot of kind of technological solutions. It's amazing. It's amazing what science can do, what it can tell us, etc., etc. The only problem with that is that then people sort of said, well, science is the answer to everything. And I think even here, trained scientists will say, I'd just hang on a minute. So it's very interesting, and you get this sort of, and you still get it in university courses, suddenly politics becomes political science, economics becomes economic science, even history, historical science. Because if you add the word science at the end, it's better, it's more rigorous, and it's, more true. And it's just window dressing, of course. I don't know how historical science is ever different from history, or political science ever really different from politics. It's not really clear. It's marketing. But there is this feeling that science should be the thing. That's the way you get to the truth, and that means you need to employ its methods. But nobody's quite then clear what its method is. How do you do historical experiments? Well, difficult to know how you experiment on the Norman Conquest. I'm not a historian, but you start thinking, and as I say, and then when you come to theology, how do you do experiments of God on? And science uses a lot of mathematics generally. Well, again, how much maths do you need to understand the Peasants' Revolt? It's difficult to know then, well, what is this scientific method that's so good? And we also know that even that sort of, very rational deduction of, theory, thesis, conclusion, or whatever, we don't employ in our lives. We don't employ it in our family lives. We don't employ it in our romantic lives or our love lives. We don't do experiments on our partners to see if they're suitable unless we're very odd. There's loads of stuff that we don't we make some of the most important decisions in our life. We fall in love with a person or a house, and we buy it, or we marry them, or whatever, and that's not a result of rational scientific investigation. Or if it is, as I say, you're odd. Of course, we try and be sensible about these decisions, But that's rather different. And in the same way, we try and be sensible about faith. We try to be sensible about what we believe, about how we practice our religion. We try to avoid the worst excesses. We try to think rationally about faith, and that's absolutely fine. It's just that we don't follow a very, very strict scientific method. So you might think, well, the trouble is with that is that, at least science has a method. I'm not sure it does, because if I asked you what it was, I don't know what you would say. I mean, Karl Popper, who is a professor of scientific method, very famous sort of philosopher, he said he always used to start his first lecture to say, my title is Professor of Scientific Method. I find this very odd because I don't think there's anything such thing as a method, just a few rules of thumb. And I think, there's a theologian called Karl Barth who said actually there is one rule of thumb. And that is that when you're investigating anything, whether it be theology or history or science or languages or literature, whatever, your method should be dictated by the thing you're studying. What you shouldn't try and do is take a method from, you shouldn't try and say, this is how we do things in physics. That's how we're going to do it in the study of Victorian literature. This is how we do something in chemistry. That's how we're going to, use the same principles to study Reformation history, because it's nonsensical. All he says is that as you find out about your subject, about the Peasants' Revolt, or about literature, or about God, or about physics, that you allow what you're looking at to kind of suggest to you what the best method is. And just think rationally about that. So, God's a good example. So you might think, right, what experiments can we do on God? But as soon as you kind of get to understand the Christian idea of God, you think, well, it's ridiculous thinking we can kind of put him in a test tube or something, or do some sort of experiment on him, or, it just doesn't make any sense of what we know about God. And in that sense, you say, okay, well, experiment goes out of the window. Are there other ways that we can know about God? Oh, well, religious experience, for instance. Oh, right, okay, here's something we can investigate. So I think that's really my conclusion, is that when we think about things and we think about God, are we thinking about God in appropriate ways? Are we really wanting to learn about him? Or sometimes, are we just wanting to learn about ourselves? That's probably the most dangerous thing. We just want, God to support our own prejudices and, tell me I'm right. And maybe God doesn't think you're right. So I think that's, as I say, my conclusion, that science is incredibly impressive. I'm a great fan. It's fascinated me since childhood. Its methods have been, fantastically successful, but they can't be applied everywhere. But each thing that we study has its own method, and we just need to think about things rationally and carefully and compassionately. And that's how we find out about stuff. And finding out about stuff is brilliant. Finding out about God or the world or doing physics or doing, about books we love. There's a whole world out there to discover. I think that's the only thing. I think that's what we all share, that wanting to discover, that sense of wonder and awe at looking at things. So I think, that is a Christian virtue. And as I say, for most of history, why Christianity and science have gone together, because it's been about discovering the wonderful world that God has made and rejoicing in it. So I hope, we're able to continue to do so. Thank you.